Hi there, welcome to the Dodge Miniature Painting YouTube channel. I'm Dodge and I wanted to start this channel up to take you through my experiences as I go through and assemble and paint some of the miniatures and models that I collect. We're going to be starting the channel with the Thunderhawk Gunship. I have loved this model since the moment I first saw it, from playing it with it back in the days of Epic, how it developed from a little boxcar into the Forgeworld, well, the Forgeworld resin model via the large pewter model that did appear for a while. I've been wanting one for ages and I've been lucky enough to finally get my hands on one. Through this process of videos, I'm going to unbox it for you. There are many unboxing videos out there on YouTube for the Thunderhawk Gunship, so I won't be spending too long a time unboxing it, but it will give you an idea of just what I'm going to be dealing with and the scale and scope of the project. We'll be looking at some of the model preparation tools I'm going to be using, some of the tools and materials I'll be using in surface preparation. We'll be looking at some of the materials I'll be using for filling. We'll go through pinning, we'll go through the glues that I'm going to use. This first video is very much set as an introduction into working with resin models and the larger resin models in particular. So very much aiming this as somebody that might be coming from the same level of experience as I have, having maybe assembled some of the Forgeworld infantry figures, worked a bit with resin, and is maybe looking to work with one of the larger kits. So I hope it proves informative, I hope you enjoy, and I hope you stick with me. Thanks very much, and let's get on with it. Okay, so this is the box as the Thunderhawk arrives. One of the first things you get in there is this A4 envelope with your certificate of authentication to say this is a legitimate 100% genuine Forgeworld model. At the bottom you'll get your serial number, and yes, this might have to get framed in the hobby room at some point. Along with that you get some of the infamous Forgeworld instructions. Rather light on detail. They always remind me of the White Dwarf heavy metal painting articles, which kind of go colour, block, magic happens, assembled, golden demon winning, paint job. Very much the same. We've got a couple of paragraphs on the undercarriage, we've got a couple of diagrams on the interior, and really that's it. So there's going to be a journey as we go through, work out how the parts fit together, what goes where, and also, probably more importantly, what order they're going to be assembled in. Next off, we have the box. I'll be honest and say I'm a little disappointed that Games Workshop and Forgeworld are still boxing these things in a normal cardboard box. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a perfectly sturdy cardboard box. It's going to protect the model inside, which is well packaged from impact damage. However, I would really like to see these now packed into the red Mechanicum style boxes that the Warlords Titan comes in. I think that would be a nice touch of Games Workshop to go and repack these in something slightly nicer. But there we go. We open it up. It's obviously not the first time I've opened this. You can see that it came with a great deal of packing. A nice touch by Games Workshop and Forgeworld now is they do include a guide to building resin model kits. Previously, this information was available on the Forgeworld website as a downloadable PDF. It's a really nice touch that you now include these inside, going through the tools, going through glues, modelling putties, preparation, hints and tips, assembly. It's a really good little leaflet packed with very useful information. So if you are getting one of these kits, do sit down and spend the couple of minutes it takes to go through and have a good read of this. And then we get to the model itself. So I'm just going to stop now for a second and take all of this out. Okay, so here's what you get inside once you've unboxed it. We see several large pieces of resin here. We have the main base and body of the vehicle, along with cutout doors. There is a rear entry access point. You can see where fuselage fits in, and the underside of the central engine there. And inside we can start to see some of the detail that we're getting with these kits. We can see obviously where our wings are going to be joining onto the model, and we can also see at the back here this very large block of resin, which is where the resin has been poured into the silicone mould, and we have what are called gates at the back here. So one of the challenges is going to be removing these nice and cleanly and making sure we have a nice flush rear area to work with. So shortly we'll be covering the tools that we'll be using to go through that. Top hull assembly, again with a nice large resin gate at the back that needs to be removed. Having had a look at this model, I think so far I've been quite lucky and I've got hold of a Thunderhawk that is pretty straight. I can't see any obvious major warps or kinks, so I'm hoping it's going to be a question of tuning the fit rather than outright changing it, but we shall see as we go on. We have our two wings and we have our front section here, bags full of weapons, accessories, flight controls, interior design, weapons, all those kinds of things. So 6 large bags of bits and then 5 large assemblies that come loose. And then chapter specific doors, Space Wolves for us. Okay, so straight away let's have a closer look at one of these pieces and we can see some of the challenges that we're going to be looking at. So unlike a normal polystyrene plastic model where you would simply just clip off the injection moulding links and then maybe sand and file down, we can see where these gates come down to the model. We can see there's rather a large contact point on both sides, and this is going to be need to take off flush and square to leave a smooth finish. So when this section sits vertically, there is a smooth finish as it joins onto our next piece. Okay, so having a look at that, we can see the challenge of removing these runs here cleanly, and then we're obviously going to have to finish up this corner and make sure that we've got the right angle as we go through and clean up this model. This is obviously where part of the cockpit sits, so all of that flash is going to have to be removed nice and cleanly, and then all of the edges tidied up in there. So we can see, looking at this isn't going to be a kit that's going to be assembled in an evening. This is going to take some considerable work, and really you need to be thinking of these kits as projects that are going to be taking a good chunk of your personal hobby time in order to fully assemble. But I have to say, having unboxed this, I am not disappointed at all. This thing is lovely. The level of detail in the interior is beautiful. I am really, really excited to start getting my hands on this and start building the thing. What we're going to do first though is we're going to start going through some of the hobby tools and accessories and some of the more Forgeworld or resin specific equipment that we might need to go through this build. Thank you very much. Okay, so first things, let's start with model preparation. As we saw when we unboxed the Thunderhawk, there's going to be a considerable amount of work done just to get the model into a stage where we can start assembling it. That's going to include removing the resin gates, cleaning the model up, cleaning up any lines, and just generally preparing each piece so it is ready to work on. So we're going to go through a selection of the tools that we think that we are going to need to use. Starting off with basic model preparation tools that you might use on any Games Workshop or scale modelling kit. First off, a hobby knife. So making sure that we've got a good quality hobby knife and that we keep a fresh, sharp blade on there. We want the blade to be doing the work. We don't ever really want to be forcing pressure when we're trying to clean up a panel line, clean up a piece of flash off of the kit. We want the knife and the sharpness of the knife to be doing the work. I go through an awful lot of blades on my knives. I buy them from my local hobby shop in packs of 5 or 10 at a time, and yes, as soon as I start to feel any kind of resistance where I can feel that the knife isn't sharp enough anymore, that blade goes in the bin. It costs a couple of quid for a pack of blades. In terms of safety, in my perspective, in my opinion, it isn't worth risking forcing the knife to cut or remove a piece of model, slipping and then cutting or injuring yourself. I'll spend a couple of quid and save that risk. Next tool I have here is a I believe it's called a reaming tool. Not a reaming tool, a flash removal tool, thank you, sorry. This was purchased again from a local train modelling shop. It's a steel triangular point on the front, which is made out of very thick, very hard carbon hardened steel, and this is great for just taking bits of sprue, use this as an example, and just using it to deburr the edge on. It doesn't go blunt. Also, the point is very good if you want to mark where you the point where you maybe want to pin a model, a backpack, an arm, whatever it might be. It's very good at just marking with a point where you want your drill point to be. Very useful tool. Games Workshop clippers. I know these aren't the cheapest of clippers out there. There are plenty of others from other third-party manufacturers that make clippers. I find these absolutely excellent though. You can clip really close to the model with these. They leave a really sharp, clean line on them. I've had these for a while now. They haven't shown any signs of blunting. Not cheap, but a very good piece of kit. Very impressed with them. One thing to note: the difference between working with resin and working with plastic. Resin is more likely to split on you, removing from the flash, removing the flash or removing the gates. So even with the GW, the Citadel snips, I will probably be cutting further back from the part than I normally would do, just to allow for any splitting of the resin. The hobby saw. Don't tend to use this a great deal with normal Games Workshop kits. Never really find there's anything from a standard kit that needs to be cut off of the sprue with a saw. However, very good when converting things. If you've glued a marine together and you then want to saw part of it off to form, whether it might be to form a casualty on the battlefield, or tanks if you want to chop up a tank, any dreadnoughts in particular. So the Contemptor dreadnoughts from the Battle of Calth set, assemble them together in one large piece. Use this to then take them in half and can then model them and change the pose a little bit to be a little less static, a little bit more dynamically posed. And last is a pair of cutters. So these are, I think my dad gave me these 20, 30 years ago, something like that. Again, if we're going to be cutting anything that might damage our GW ones, including when we move on to it, pinning models, then yeah, just having a thicker, more heavy duty pair of cutters is very handy to have. Okay, model surface preparation. One of the key parts in achieving a pleasing finish to any of your models is making sure that we remove any surface imperfections, whether they are mould lines from the sprue, or in Forgeworld cases, whether they are where the resin moulds have been cast, removing details from flash, removing where the gates have attached into the model. So we have a series of tools for cleaning our model up and getting the surface ready for working on. So first off, a series of different types of metal files with varying different grits on them, I suppose you could say, and various different shapes. So traditional flat file, this one is a fairly, you can see that in there, a fairly fine finishing tool, whereas we might have something that you can see here where I've just been using this to take some green stuff off of a conversion I've been working on. You can see this is a much coarser grit for taking more off in one go. One thing it's worth noting, this is one of your first experiences with a Forgeworld resin model, working with resin is softer than the polystyrene plastics used in the GW kits. That means if you're using a metal file, the same amount of pressure on a resin kit is going to remove more of the material than it would on a Games Workshop plastic kit. So just to bear in mind when you are filing down surface areas or filing down imperfections, just be careful that using a metal file is going to remove more material than it would on a plastic kit. With resin, I find myself working a lot with sandpapers, sanding sponges and sanding sticks. I find these are brilliant bits of kit for getting a nice smooth finish and for allowing me to get the model to the degree of surface preparation that I want. So we've got a degree of grits on sanding sticks, so you can see this is a much coarser grit here. You can see here the debris left over where I've been again finishing a conversion and removing large amounts of green stuff off the material. This is great for building, for getting the worst of the initial stages of any imperfection you want to remove down. Moving down through progressively finer and finer grits until we get down to an extra fine sanding stick, which is really a polishing stick. So if you want to get a perfect finish on your model, say you have filled a panel gap or you have filled a dent in a flat surface where there might have been damage to it in transit, or if it's a slight mould imperfection, this polishing stick really does give you an ultra fine finish on the end result. Tamiya sanding sponges, these are brilliant, absolutely brilliant. chop them down into small pieces to, well, not waste the large sheets, and also to get into the areas that other sanding sponges cannot reach. Various different grits, so we've got a 1500 fine grade, 1000 less fine grained, and a 600 which is slightly coarser. These are absolutely brilliant. I go through tons of these stuff preparing my models as we work on prepare the services. Again, a couple of sanding sponges. Tend to use these less. Great on large flat surfaces, but for Games Workshop and hobby models, they tend to just be a little bit too large to work into intricate areas to clean the model up. Tend to find myself only really using these on tanks and on large surfaces, so they may actually see more use on the Thunderhawk than they would do on a normal 28 epic scale Marine, for example. And last but not least, traditional sandpaper. Again, I bought a pack of it from my local hardware store that had various degrees of grits in there. Can be used wet or dry. Again, brilliant for getting into small surfaces, for removing large blocks of material off, or down to a much finer grade polishing pad. So those are the traditional tools that we would use for preparing the model. I don't envisage anything dramatically different whilst preparing the Thunderhawk, just that there is going to be more surface area to prepare. Next we move on to filling any gaps. So this is a Forgeworld very large model. I'm expecting there to be gaps in the fitting in various places, which are going to need to be filled. They're going to be needed to be filled smoothly and to leave a good finish so they look invisible on the final finished product. So some of the materials that I use to fill holes in models. First off, Milliput. Been around for years. Standard two-part modelling putty. So it's an epoxy. You have 2 rolls of material, cut off the amount that you need, knead them together until you get a nice, smooth, even coloured finish, and then use that to fill your model. Has a good working time of, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes, maybe even longer than that. Again, if you want to fill large gaps in models, in kits, then Milliput generally is my go-to. Games Workshop green stuff, again, there are other green stuff manufacturers out there. This just happened to be some that I picked up at my local GW. Similar principle to Milliput. You have a 2-part epoxy putty, cut off the amount you need, roll it together, and off you go. One thing I tend to find with the Games Workshop green stuff over Milliput is I tend to find the Games Workshop green stuff is somewhat smoother of a finish. So I might tend to use Milliput to fill very, very large gaps, and then maybe finish them off with a little bit of green stuff over the top. It really depends on the type of gap that I'm working with. I tend to pick and choose between the two, as I think one is going to do a better job than the other. Last off, liquid green stuff. This first came onto the market, well, this has been repackaged, but a few years ago. It is essentially a liquid version of Games Workshop's 2-part green stuff. Slightly different chemical compound, can be thinned down with water, for example, which makes it very helpful in getting a smooth finish on the end. Tend to put this on very delicately rather than trying to scoop it out of the tub and put it on. I have an old battered brush that I will use that I then will decant some of that onto a palette or onto a bit of tissue, something like that, onto a piece of tile, and then carefully brush into the model, let it set for a little bit, and then use some of the tools we've got below to smooth the finish off. Ultimately, a little wipe across with a damp brush helps get a fantastically fat finish. Just looking at some of the tools, these are traditional hobbying tools. So we have this isn't from an art shop, a flat chisel-headed shaper. So if you're green stuffing into a square corner, for example, you can use this shaper to push your green stuff into any gaps within the corner and get a nice flush finish. And then we have a couple of sculpting tools. Not that I do much sculpting, but the different shape on the heads allows us to press down on large flat panels, or maybe press down into a corner and get a nice flush finish, which we can then finish off once the green stuff or the milliput secured with the sanding and finishing products that we've already covered. Okay, now we need to look at the tools and equipment we might need when we come to pin the model. First off, pin vise. So this is great for just putting in different type small holes into a model that are going to be used to pin. So you have a different degree of bits that will fit into the top. The assembly screws together. Twist at the base, and you can use that to screw in and pin something through your model. Next we have the Tamiya hobby drill. I bought this on Amazon a few months ago. It came across from Japan, so it took a few weeks to get here, but ended up costing around £14, something like that. It comes as a self-assembly kit that you fit together, powered off of 2 AA batteries, and it's a great low torque power driver slash hobby drill for going through plastic and through resin. I wouldn't screw through metal with this. If you had a metal model, this probably isn't the tool for it. It doesn't have enough torque, but for plastic and for resin, if you don't want to, if you just want to get a nice little pin vise hole in there to pin a model, this thing is absolutely indispensable. Next, we have a series of different sized drill bits, ranging from really fine microscopic sizes right the way up to the largest one in there is a 2mm drill bit. So we can see a couple of these lower down the range I've actually snapped where I've used them. Although these are treated steel, the smaller ones can still be a bit flimsy. What I tend to do is just buy packs of the smaller ones of the most common sizes I'm going to be using, so that if one does break, then I've got more in there to use. In terms of actually the material we're going to use to pin the model, paper clips. First off, regular standard paper clip, which you can fold out straight and then snip off however long you need, super glue into one end, super glue into the other end, and then off you go. If you have a slightly larger model or something that you think needs to take a bit more weight, then you can get larger paper clips. These are more heavy duty, the wire on them is thicker, does come with a treatment on it that just flakes off, but you don't need to worry about that. This will obviously need something closer to a 1.5mm drill bit, but if you're talking about getting a heavier piece of resin or something that's larger, bulkier to be pinned together, then you want to start looking at this gauge of paper clip. So those are the two gauges I use, and very much just depend on which one I'm going to use on the weight and the type of join that I'm going to be performing. Next up, magnetisation. So one of the things we're probably going to be doing for this model is magnetising the weapon options on it, specifically the under fuselage missiles and probably the main cannon on the top of it are the two areas I expect that I will be magnetising. So for these we use rare earth magnets. Come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. The ones that I'm most likely to be using for the larger cannon are these chunky 8mm by 2mm magnets, and as you can see from there, they're fairly tough to take apart. Yeah, these can't be pried apart with your fingers. They are incredibly strong. If you want to magnetise part of your model so it can be removed and replaced, then these really are the way to get the most out of the Games Workshop and Forgeworld kits. To give you an example, we look at this knight that I've been working on, fully magnetised to allow arm options to come off, so we can replace all of the weapon systems, and in this case the arm and the front weapon come off as well. So from one Night Warden kit I've made all of the variants on there. Next up, adhesives, glues. what are we going to use to actually stick this model together? So, for the main part, I'm expecting that I'm going to be using super glue through this build. I tend to use Gorilla Glue's thicker gap filling mixture. Has a reasonable set time of about 10-20 seconds, depending on the surface that you're bonding, but has a good gap filling quantity as well. So buy this from my local B&Q, which is a UK home wares and tools DIY shop. That was really poorly worded. And yes, comes with a fairly thick dispenser on the top, so you're not really going to be applying this glue particularly precisely. It's much more suited when you want to join panels together, and there may be some gaps in there that you're also going to want to fill. For more precise applications, we have the Zap glues. So they do their medium consistency and their thin consistency as well. Both come with a precision application nozzle. The medium one's wandered off somewhere, but these again great if you want to do a more precise piece of super gluing. So this is what I'll be using where I'm super gluing the weapon systems together, super gluing more intricate work together. Be using these products. Again, probably going to be going through quite a bit of these, so probably need to be getting some more of that. Now, as this is a particularly heavy model, parts of this model are going to have to take a reasonable amount of weight. The whole thing weighs several kilograms when assembled. I'm going to also be using some epoxy resin as well. Now, in this case, I'm going to be using JB World's resin. This comes as a two-part epoxy, similar to the green stuff and milliput that we saw earlier, but rather than being a putty, this is actually an epoxy resin type glue. This stuff has a fairly long work time. The set time is about 4 or 5 hours on this, but when it sets, which is fully sets after about a day, nothing is coming apart on this. That is glued in there for life. So if you want to really, really make sure something is never going to come apart, something like this, fantastic. Just to note, if this is your first time working with resin products, working with either Forgeworld resin products or other resin products, this is why I'm looking at super glue and looking at epoxies. Resin will not glue with plastic glue or polystyrene cement if you prefer. So although this would be my go-to glue if I'm gluing together a Games Workshop plastic sprue with the precision applicator, this stuff's just brilliant for plastic kits. For resin kits, this isn't going to do the job. It's not going to form a bond. Polystyrene cement or plastic glue works by effectively melting and fusing both sides of the join together rather than a super glue cyanoacrylate type bond. So although this stuff is brilliant for plastic models, for resin, no, that's not what we want. We want super glue and we want epoxy. Okay, so getting toward the end of this list now, thank you for bearing with me. I just thought it was important to go through all of the equipment that we're going to be using in one chunk on the video, so if I'm using a tool or something further down the line, then you've got a reference point that you can go back and look at. So first off, as this is a much larger model, I'm anticipating on using some steel rods in the model in order to hold the wing assemblies together and to take the weight, the load of the flight stand that I'm going to be using, which is likely to be a 20mm acrylic rod. So just simple basic power drill driver. This is going to allow me to use a larger bit in order to drill through and put a steel rod through the model, and also then a 20mm, I believe they call them paddle bits, at the front where I'm going to be going through the model in order to put a mounting point for the flying base. After that, we have the Dremel, the hobbyist's essential tool. If you're working on any of the large games, any of the large Forgeworld models, or even just to do any kind of modelling or crafting around the house, these things are fantastically useful. Come with an assortment of bits that go on the end, including cutting discs, including sanding wheels, both normal traditional sandpaper and wire bristle if you're sort of trying to get a more finished surface. A word of advice, the sanding discs will cut through resin extremely quickly. So this Dremel has a rotating RPM dial at the back there, so I can dial in how fast I need the front to move, and that's going to help dictate how much material I'm taking away. But again, incredibly useful tool. I will most likely be using this in conjunction with one of the cutting discs in order to remove those large resin gates that we saw. And as well as that, I've also got a set of filing and grinding tools grinding tips here, various different sizes and shapes. These will probably not see too much of use in this build. This is actually a new set, as my last set, believe it or not, had actually started to wear out. But some of these, for example this triangular shaped head here, are very good if you want to model some battle damage. They make great impact damage on tanks, on large vehicles, if you want to give it that battle-worn look. I haven't yet at this point decided which way I'm going to go with this Thunderhawk, whether it's going to be more pristine or whether it's going to be more weathered. Probably more weathered, as that's my style. So we may end up using that, but we'll have to see what takes my fancy as we go down the build. As we've just talked about power tools, the natural next step is to look at some safety equipment. First up, safety glasses. These cost pence, a couple of quid at most, from your local DIY supplyist. If you're using a power drill, if you're using a Dremel, there is the potential for things to go pinging off. You only get one pair of eyes in your life. These will save your sight. Absolutely get yourself a pair of these if you're going to be doing anything like this. Squinting and hoping isn't going to be the way forward on this. So yes, if I'm using my Dremel, if I'm using my drill, then I've got a pair of safety glasses on just in case. Next up is, in this case, a respirator mask. Resin isn't the nicest of materials. If it gets into your lungs, it's going to irritate your lungs, it's going to irritate your breathing. If you have a breathing condition such as asthma, then you might be particularly susceptible to this as well. So at the very least, you want a hobby dust mask, the type that you might use when you're sanding down something around the house. In my case, as I do a lot of airbrushing as well, I've got a full-on odour rated respirator mask. This cost about £20 from my local hardware store, and the filters on both sides are replaceable as they get clogged up, as they get used. But for me, this is again essential tool. If I'm working with resin or if I'm using my airbrush, then I've got the mask on to help keep my lungs safe. Okay, straightening resin. Resin, as a natural part of the process, will slightly shrink when it comes out of the moulds. This is an inevitable part of the process of working with resin. So if a kit arrives to you and there is some warpage in there, some pieces aren't exactly straight or aren't exactly square, then that's due to the nature of the way resin behaves when it's cooling down, when it's setting. So we need to consider being able to straighten our kit out. The hairdryer. This one has a couple of settings on there, so rather than straight to surface of the sun temperature, there is a medium setting which I can use to gently heat the resin up, and then when it's the right temperature you will feel it as it starts to become pliable, as it starts to become a bit malleable. We can bend the resin to the shape that we might need, or we might indeed be straightening it out, setting the right 90-degree bend, whatever it might be. We've got the ability to warm the resin up to the point where it becomes malleable, but not too far so it starts to disintegrate on you, and then we can get that resin back into tip-top condition, ready to build. As well as the hairdryer, might also use hot water as well. So particularly for smaller pieces such as ammo feeds, that kind of thing, I will use hot water. Just dunk the piece in there with a pair of tweezers, again until it becomes soft, and then it can be removed and then moulded to whatever shape it might be. So these are the two common ways you're going to use to straighten out the resin kits that you might buy from Forgeworld or any other resin manufacturers. If these two aren't enough, then there are obviously more extreme approaches that you can take. So, thank you very much for sticking through this first video. As you can see, I've wanted to cover a lot of detail about the tools that I'm going to be using in the process as I expect to be going through. Pitching this again, as I mentioned, as very much a beginner's introduction series of videos on how to work with Forgeworld models. I hope you found it interesting, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one, where we'll actually get to grips with the model and we'll be starting to remove some of those gates and resin blocks that I mentioned, and we'll be starting to clean it up. Thanks very much, see you in the next video.